Hello. So, unfolding the territory, map making and its subjectivities. The etymology of the verb to map limits our understanding of the act. Stemming from the Latin mappa, meaning a sheet, the root defines mapping as the transcription of data onto a physical surface. The nautical chart of Europe, made in the 1670s, demonstrates the selective registration that happens in that transcription. In mapping out the coast of Europe, it alludes to a desire for travel and expansion towards uncharted territories. The map predates conventions of representation and orientation. North is to the right of the drawing, therefore placing the Netherlands at the center of the map, and hence at the center of their world. However, reading into the context of map demotes its centrality. The paper map is only half the story. Centering the act of mapping expands the definition. Vermeer's The Geographer emphasizes this act. Mapping becomes an active, time-based practice. From sea to forest to desert to shrublands, our 4 case studies are all frontier spaces, undomesticated sites requiring extensive research and registration to transform them. But they're also each subject to at least 2 regimes of representation, multiple attempts to capture that landscape. Much like the geographer who translates the world into the map, what takes place in that moment of translation? There exists a gap in the translation of the ground to the map, a pixelated zone of ambiguity. We propose to isolate that moment when the gap emerges to reveal the subjectivity of mapping. By exposing the act of pixelization, we unfold the implications on the ground. Can we freeze that moment of registration to analyze the widening gap? In The Geographer, Vermeer reads registration in 3 steps: observation, out the window, translation, through the geographer, and dissemination, through the map. In between each step, abstraction occurs. The translation gap, a fundamental difference between an ungraspable ecosystem and its selective synthesis.
This gap produces a narrative then projected onto the landscape. In the case of the Aboriginals in the Northern Territory of Australia, the narration of the landscape happened in a literal sense, through the production of songlines. So here the journey of 2 dogs is used to describe and rationalize the landscape. The story mentions place names in the journey sequence for a traveler navigating across the territories, for trade, ritual, and ceremony. Narrative is driven by the intent of the user. The US Wilkes expedition in the 1840s was carried out with the intent of expanding American influence in remote regions of the world through knowledge accumulation and producing a specific narrative. The maps from this expedition embedded their intentions into the very language of the registration. In the Marshall Islands maps, several instances highlight this. For example, islets are represented as disconnected from the rest of the atoll. The vague scribbles obfuscate life on the islet. The sandbanks are represented as discontinuous lines, suggesting that the island is not legitimate enough as a landmass. And finally, the idea of the entrance refers to access to the lagoon, the island perceived to be of lesser importance than its waters. The intentional dematerialization of the island reinforces the myth of the terra nullius. It erases villages and plantations to justify dispossession and foreshadows what was to come on Bikini Island. A map is not objective. Reading intention into the map recenters the mapmaker's subjectivity. Vermeer places the focal point between the geographer and the map, reminding us of the mapmaker as agent in the production of narrative. The mapmaker as an individual is dead, replaced by multiple enterprises, public or private, and the technological apparatus which enables it. A gray zone of ambiguity exists between the mapping agents and the map, as the map magically sheds the mapmaker's subjectivity for an absolute objective view. In the US 1982 maps of the Marshall Islands, their attempts to obfuscate subjectivity are evident. The coordinates grid the landscape, which is read through the supposedly objective abstract system. The flattening grid, like Vermeer's maps with no focal point, exposes a contradiction. Is the God's eye view not as distinct a position as any other?
Instead, shifting to elevation implies that the mapping agent has a more immediate relationship to the landscape he's observing. What does it mean to map in perspective? In the context of the Inca Empire in Central America, the quipu was used for registering ground data and record keeping, capturing intricate details about the land, resources, and society. The Kipu expands our definition of map making, embodying the creator's experiences and perspective. It operates as a living map. Nodes tied at specific distances encode diverse data such as crop types. Each node becomes a marker of the map maker's engagement within the environment. Despite direct engagement, there's still mediation through the object, which acts as a bridge between the map maker's reality and the abstract representation. The Kipu is part of a circular mapping process where it's made from local material by an individual perceiving and representing the landscape firsthand, and through the record producing a biological map of the territory. Once it is no longer used, it is buried. Closing the mapping cycle, it again becomes part of the ground it represents. In the context of the Marshall Islands, mapping ends in the body without the need for a mediating object. Here, the mapping technique developed out of the needs of the mapper-navigator traveling between the atolls for trade and ceremonies. The navigator learned to situate himself by sensing wave patterns. The water's movements are synthesized by the canoe, making the sea readable at the scale of an individual, mobilizing the body as a tool of registration. Mapping here occurs at the resolution of the water. The map maker, the map, and its recipient are all collapsed into one subject.
Looking at implications for ownership, it appears that embodied forms of mapping centers use of a property. The map is not to own. In the Nakab, the Bedouins, increasingly sedentary, settled in harsh, desertic environments. Inhabitation of the land was therefore based on their capacity to develop methods of sustenance through sophisticated means of cultivating the arid land, finding pastures for grazing, using ancient wells, but also by maintaining hold over certain trading routes. Until the mid-1800s, territory was not tied to a projected plot, but to use, with tribal land covering vast, if shifting, expanses. The registration of the use is transmitted orally over generations. It did not require written records, making it a continuous process of territorial redefinition.
هذا الشغل أخذنا 3 أشهر. تشرين الأول، تشرين الثاني، كانون الأول. خلصنا الشغل بحدود تاريخ 5 كانون الثاني. بسنة 1948 أبوي اشترى تراكتور. بتذكره منيح. كان لونه أحمر. زرعنا فلفل حار، خيار عربي، قرع اللي مع رقبة، واللي من النوع اللي بيتفضى وبيتنشف.
The light touch of the Bedouins on the ground is clear in the very few material traces, beyond, for instance, their cemeteries useful for dating their presence, the stains left behind by a cattle pen, or the light scratchings of ploughing. This absence of material evidence of ownership has led to a repeated contestation of the land by consecutive powers, starting with the Ottomans, then under the British mandate, and into today with the Israeli state. Their use of the territory acted as a direct challenge to the notions of empire and nationhood, imagined on various maps, as the Bedouins seamlessly crossed boundaries drawn in ink.
Each of our sites hold multiple maps simultaneously, from the northern territories in Australia, to the Marshall Islands, to the Inca Empire, to the Nakab. Overlaying the 2 modes of registration creates disjunctures, and begs the question, what gives one legitimacy over the other? A map is not the ground. How do these maps negotiate access to the ground which they describe? Ultimately, the struggle for legitimacy takes us out of the frame of the painting and brings into focus the wall on which it hangs. The wall informs the viewer's understanding of Dutch territory in of the Dutch authority in drawing territory. The agency of the map is therefore reinforced by the wall supporting it. Most significantly, the Dutch map was exhibited during a fundraiser to the French colonization of Algeria, further illustrating the centrality of mapping in colonizing ventures.
In the Nakab, the Ottoman 1906 tribal map attempted to fix fluid tribal boundaries, over time contributing to the sedentarization of these tribes. To match the map and secure their right to remain, tribes gradually transitioned from quasi-autonomous nomads to more sedentary citizens. The notion of the desert threshold or aridity line continues to serve as justification for land dispossession, claiming that desertic conditions made it too hostile for anybody to make claims to the land. The Israelis continue to cement the desert boundary according to an arbitrary metric of rainfall, the 200 millimeter isohate boundary, and in doing so refuse to recognize many Bedouin villages south of that line. The arbitrariness of the weather produces its own legal framework for justification. The aridity line becomes a territorial reality, delegitimizing other claims to the land. In Israeli courts, the oral registration of the territory by the Bedouins does not hold up as legitimate testimony, contrary to the scientific episteme of meteorological maps, leading to many villages being unrecognized and consequently destroyed. The erasure is crowned by afforestation projects, covering up any leftover trace of previous settlements. Ultimately, the map prevailed, and needless to say, it is the same government committing a genocide as we speak. In 1946, 100 years after the first mapping of the Marshall Islands, the first nuclear bomb is detonated within the Bikini Lagoon, fully legitimizing the American gaze embedded in Wilkes' map. The invisibility of the island foreshadowed on the map led to its treatment as such, evacuating the residents to make the emptiness of the map a reality. As reflected in the sale of the photograph of the nuclear test, this gaze still defines our cultural understanding of the bomb as one of value, less an object of fear and more one which inspires awe. Not only is the price indicative of the existence of this gaze, but the photographer's inclusion in the category, the art of exploration, makes clear that it is the same gaze as that of Wilkes embarking on his mapping. But also, if exploration is an art, then is it not an acknowledgement that mapping is a fiction? Looking at the maps in this room representing climate matters, we feel compelled to ask, can we identify the agency involved in the mapping and the subjective narratives that emerge?
I don't know if anyone else wants to, but I think it was AJA said that it's impossible to conceive of an image independently of the means of depicting it. So that the act of making a map in a way constructs a kind of reality or a fiction. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it is a constructive act. And one of the things that's come up this week is how many of the kinds of knowledge that we need to understand what's happening to the world are invisible and not mapped. So I wonder what your conclusion might be from where you are now to help towards that. I think there are things that it's very difficult to conceive of how to make a map for. At the same time, you're pointing out all of the difficulties of both logical and conceptual of mapping.
Yeah. But I think so far we don't necessarily have an answer as to what a proper map would be, what it would look like, but it's more about sort of recognizing the position that you have as the mapper and your inherent subjectivities in the way you represent something and select the information. So, yeah.
So would you conclude there is no such thing as a disinterested mapmaking?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely one of our conclusions. Yeah.
Sure. Anyone else like to ask a question? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Our investigation is titled Risk, Property Suspended, the appropriation of an anthropocentric notion of an ethnocentric apparatus. In 1977, the political and social theorist Paul Virilio stated that the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck, and with that, how wealth and gain comes with a sacrifice. Historically, the term risk was primarily associated with maritime activities and referred to the perils faced by sailors and merchants during sea voyages. In the 18th century, however, the concept became closely linked to the emerging insurance industry, which offered protection against various risks, such as shipwrecks, fires, and other foreseeable events. By the 19th and 20th century, the understanding of risk as something that could be reduced to mere statistics and quantifiable data was centerfold.
The culture of risk, on the other hand, is not quantifiable nor monolithic, but rather liminal and chaotic. Individuals and organizations have varying approaches and responses to environmental risk depending on their physical and environmental circumstances. Furthermore, the unequal distribution of environmental burdens with regards to socioeconomic status produces an additional parallel, the relationship between risk and vulnerability. The degree to which risk has an effect is explicitly related to the degree of vulnerability, both physically and socioeconomically. The organization, assessment, and management of risk in the 21st century involves a complex interplay of power and authority. Standards and rules are set by elite stakeholders, such as governments and regulatory bodies, that can affect the behavior of corporations, individuals, and land, but not always in their best interest. Today, environmental risk has become primarily concerned with the market economy, whilst human beings and land itself has become secondary. One could argue we have entered a new sphere of disaster capitalism, a term coined by the activist Naomi Klein, which involves a new phenomenon of exploiting crisis or risk for economic or political gain. Risk in this sense has been appropriated not to protect, but as a profit-oriented apparatus used by elite stakeholders to capitalize off.
Risk's association with the market and insurance mean it could be seen as a non-spatial phenomenon. However, a consequence of this is its indirect relationship to the value of land and property. Property value is seen as directly dependent upon the value of the land upon which it sits, which describes an extractive relationship between the subject, the landowner, and the object, the land. The value of such is conditioned by a series of dynamic and interconnected variables and relationships. Significantly, the contemporary understanding of this extractive relationship relies on the condition and assumption that land is an object that is fixed, stable, and static. However, with the arrival of natural forces, the notion of property lies suspended, revealing property as unstable. Furthermore, the question of ecology and its relationship to risk seems to have been left out of the equation. The Anthropocene and its effects on climate change are more pronounced than ever, yet risk assessment seems to prioritize the protection of man-made environments, not taking into account the effect and vulnerability of the land itself. Referring to Aldo Leopold's 1949 text, A Sand County Almanac, humans should expand their moral and ethical considerations beyond other humans to include the entire ecological community. By considering the ecological perspective and the vulnerable relationships within it, perhaps we should think less through the lens of disaster capitalism and think more like a mountain. Where risk used to be centered around the human being, today it is less anthropocentric and more econocentric. Through the analysis of 3 specific case studies in Western Europe, our aim is to reveal the tendency to exploit climate change and its association with risk in favor of capitalism and planning departments, development and progress. By looking through the lens of risk and focusing on the moment of environmental destabilization, the liminal moment in which environmental forces upset or destabilize specific territories, our aim is to reveal the asymmetries of risk and to scrutinize the systems that we devise to deal with climate change, and with that, the static way in which we understand the notion of property.
In 2018, there was a fatal fire in a vacation coastal area of Athens, an area sidelined in terms of cities planning. The failure of the government to modernize its urban planning and the absence of a national risk assessment resulted in the non-existence of preventive natural disaster infrastructure and planning. Outdated planning strategies resulted in narrow streets, unclear pathways, poor maintenance, poor insulation and property construction, which were updated only after the disaster. The risk assessment was in this sense absorbed into the new urban planning framework, with the urban planner assuming the role of the risk assessor, but only as an afterthought. As a result of this new urban planning and state authority, land was extracted from private owners to accommodate new preventative measures such as wider roads, pathways, and pavements. The risk imposed provided the state with a blank sheet of opportunity to rebuild properties and infrastructure. Consequently, the new planning and development increased property value in the area, which had a direct impact on construction companies and real estate markets' capital gain. The loss of land from private individuals at the scale of the plot resulted in the increase in value of the market economy at the scale of the city. Rather than primarily focusing on the protection of the ecology, risk has in this case been appropriated as an apparatus of power and profit. However, risk assessment in itself could be seen as an unfounded and problematic tool, which holds its own capitalist agenda. In the UK, whilst the National Risk Assessment does exist, its central organization and unequal distribution highlights risk asymmetry and capitalist prioritization, revealing a regional hierarchy. The NRA is organized, controlled, and maintained by government agencies who prioritize areas of economic and political significance. Subsequently, decentralized areas of high deprivation, the vulnerable, have been left out.
In the past decade, the UK coastal town Hemsby has lost 30 metres of land due to coastal erosion. Yet its presence is missing from the National Risk Assessment mapping, despite its vulnerability both economically and physically. This gap in the mapping and subsequent failure of preventative measures led to 2 catastrophic erosion disasters in 2013 and 2018, which severely damaged coastal properties. Due to a misalignment in UK land and property law, the lack of compensation for affected households and government intervention has led to disputes in property rights. UK property law distinguishes land from other types of property, emphasising its permanence and thus the creation of its long-term rights. In contrast, UK land law recognises the foreshore as a movable freehold, a location prone to change over time. The doctrine of erosion dictates that in cases of erosion, the land reverts to the foreshore owner and the original landowner loses their claim. If coastal erosion results in the complete loss of land, the physical ownership of that land is effectively distinguished. In UK legal terms, this is referred to as dereliction, and the land usually reverts to the Crown, who is the ultimate owner of the foreshore and seabed, who assumes the title deeds. Homeowners in Hemsby made claim to these losses, but their policies did not provide cover. Standard UK insurance tends to include damage related to gradual processes like coastal erosion, as damage to property is inevitable rather than fortuitous. But the gap in the risk assessment mapping left homeowners unaware of these liabilities, which allowed insurance companies to avoid payments and adjust premiums for existing properties, therefore increasing their revenue and profiting off their loss. Furthermore, the rate of coastline erosion directly correlates with property value reduction, both on the coastline and in the territory overall, which saw a 20% devaluation after the 2013 disaster. The lack of insurance, decrease in land value, unaffordable mortgages, and low income have rendered residents unable to sell their homes due to their unlivable or unsellable nature.
Risk in this sense undermines the contemporary notion of property, an asset that is protected and sacred, and which carries with it a legal right to possess, use, and dispose of. In this moment of destabilization, the extractive relationship has devolved, severely diminishing the value of the subject's object, even to the point of rendering it worthless. In its place, a concealed transaction emerges, involving the Crown, creditors, insurers, developers, and local authorities who directly and indirectly profit from and capitalize off the imposed risk. However, the presence of risk assessment does not always guarantee proportionate protection. In cases where land holds extraction rights for gravel, sand, and coal, the presence of risk assessment and the subsequent need for protection is sometimes ignored, in order to serve and provide private enterprises and companies the opportunity for profit. During the 2021 flood in Western Germany, a gravel quarry south of the village Blessem repeatedly filled with water, eroding and swallowing up the surrounding fields and houses. In spite of the area being marked as high risk, the government took no measures to protect the surrounding environment, prioritizing instead the act of extraction itself and the opportunity for profit, at the expense of private and residential landowners. However, since the Gravel Corporation has declined any responsibility, therefore avoiding any financial liability, this shows once again how risk assessment has failed to support those who most need it, the vulnerable, and how risk itself prefavors the dominant market actors and corporations. The movement of land ownership, credit, insurance scores, property liability, and the subject involved is conditioned by the asymmetries of risk. In this moment, the fixed geometry of property does not account for its vulnerability, nor its fluidity of the geology upon which it sits. and the way in which we value property is displaced.
The Lockean idea of property considers land as an object that is a subject to forces. However, it could be considered a subject in itself, as an entity that holds its own natural forces. The system is in this sense entirely disabled, as we now have two subjects that are working in opposition to each other. Stood as separate entities, they both have their own forces which act in opposition. This causes a block in the system, and there's no way for the landowner to extract any value.
What this investigation calls into question through this moment of destabilization is the contemporary notion of property, the way land and property value is prescribed, the way it's defined, registered, administered, and maintained. It does not reflect the nature of land itself, a subject that is fluid, dynamic and temporal. It seeks to mark, define, and hold things in place through fixed boundaries and property lines, separation and segregation. Property is in this sense unstable and inflexible, with a geometry that does not correspond to or reflect the geology on which it sits.
This instability, however, has always been there, defined by our ecology. It's just that the fixed notion of property conceals it. Only once challenged, through a moment of destabilization, such as environmental disaster, does it become visible. This disguise is what makes the environmental forces, lack of compensation, and rights to space appear unjust, and its misapprehension is what allows for the extraction of value from individuals through credit scores and insurance, and through mortgages, assets, and land. The collective denial of climate change, the unequal and negligent distribution of preventative measures in response to natural disaster, and the exploitation of risk is proof that we have entered a new sphere of disaster capitalism, an era that disregards the well-being of our ecology as a whole in favor of a capital gain. The way in which risk is framed, through the dominance of property ownership and centralized systems, feeds into the extractive relationships which it's formed by, an economical loop that serves the government and private entities. The aesthetic of the Anthropocene just disguises this system, which enables the extraction to take place.
We saw an argument yesterday evening on the history of economy and in relation to climate change and likely things. So I think there's some real insights in what you say and some implications that go far beyond the not only property rights and ownership. So the kind of parcelization of responsibility for the land resides currently with ownership. And governments and other entities can avoid responsibility for mitigation, remediation, and so forth. Did you know the AA has a risk register?
It has a register?
Yes. Every institution, every educational institution is required to have a risk register. Every public institution is required to have one. Every business in the UK is required to have one. And one of the aspects of them that you were touching on comes in the relationship in the risk assessment between impact and likelihood. So one of the ways people dodge responsibility for what would be the highest risk, the biggest impact, is to say it's actually not, it's very unlikely it's going to happen. So total risk assessments are made up of those two things. So the severe ecological risks that we face, in financial terms or economic terms, can be minimized by stating, and they don't have to prove it, there's actually a very low probability that will happen. I don't know if that's helpful, it's just something I've been... Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, there's this interesting connection you guys made between government and insurance and risk. And it just made me think, even in 2008, the financial crisis in America created an extremely terrible precedent where the government bailed out insurance companies. And suddenly you have, state connected in this sort of financial industry. I'm I didn't have a question, but it kind of, that's where my thoughts went. And I'm curious in terms of uncovering this, yeah, I don't know where to go with that. Yeah. Yeah.
In the case of Greece, for example, I think there is a very weak culture towards insurance because people don't really believe in it, and there isn't such a big belief in it. And the reason is that they are afraid that government will bail. And I think following what happened in 2008 and the economic crisis in Greece, so of course, economy plays a huge role. Trust in these kind of bodies is really important. And I think that there are some measures taking place from the government, for example, alleviating tax cuts for people that insure themselves privately in case of such events. But it's still quite far from the reality of Greece. I don't know if you guys want to relate it.
Yes. Hi. So you make a very eloquent presentation, and you kind of nail down a really strong critique about the way that sometimes the conversation about the Anthropocene is hijacked through those sort of what you kind of portray to us through the case studies as like technocratic means. Now, I think within that, I'm just curious to kind of ask you, as students in an architecture school, where do you position yourself within that? Because it seems like, this in the same way the previous conversation, the argument kind of stands. I think we're all kind of convinced. I'm wondering, how do you position yourself as an architect, or the role of the architect in regards to that, whether it's something that kind of branches out towards a more legislative, jurisdictional side of that is more strategic in seeing how we kind of delegate property to architects or land designation to architects, or alternatively as a more kind of classical capital A architect that operates within a certain context, right?
I think what it was quite interesting was that there's an absurdity about these natural disasters, that they're actually accumulating in a housing market where a lot of like houses has to be built because of the natural disaster, and people are actually making profit out of the situation. But instead of focusing on that, we are more focusing on the system which embeds this and provides these like kind of unfair situation and these profits which are made after the disaster, and unveil these. Now I have to say the word crack. We left it out of our presentation, but like it unveils these cracks which were always there, and this is kind of the system which supports the situation afterwards. And I think this is kind of our take on it, which our moment of interest. Yeah,
I agree, but also to add to that, I think after what happened in Grenfell, for example, in London, I think this is a case where we saw how legislation has started to change after that, and how the way we construct buildings became a bit more clear in terms of risk and in terms of disaster. And for example, in cases like in Greece where we see that there is poor insulation, I think as architects we need to kind of start thinking a bit more about prevention also through the building itself and property itself and like plot itself. So just adding another layer on how we're thinking about it.
Thank you.
Terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, is a doctrine that was heavily employed by the British Empire to expand its territorial reach. It allowed the British to, one, look beyond traditional laws or modes of inhabitation subsisting within a territory that they deemed to be uncivilized, and two, dispossess of lands in need of improvement. Simultaneously, the personification of native people as savages created a further division between the colonizer and the colonized. Living through intimate knowledge of the landscape and family-based social structures, colonizers deemed wild and untamed, racially inferior and unproductive, or merely innocent and childlike. Thus, this emerges in the characterization of the figures of the civil and the savage which evolved throughout the colonial project. and so we aim to address 3 questions. How did the British use the concept of terra nullius to deem lands available for dispossession? How did the figures of the civil and the savage emerge from legal frameworks to serve as the basis for racial regimes of property? And how did pre-colonial modes of living demonstrate a stronger understanding of territory? We will do so by considering the architectural objects of 3 former British colonies in radically different geopolitical contexts and timeframes, in each case spanning the period from the first forms of land demarcation by the British in connection with property law to the moment property rights were handed over to native populations. We argue that the abstraction and financialization of property law resulted in a detachment of the landowner from the land itself and its geographical place in time, as well as the control and ownership over the body that previously occupied that land. The case study of Ireland has often been referred to as the earliest enforcement of English common law upon acquired territory. Whilst Ireland was neither uninhabited nor uncultivated, and in fact already had its own recognised legal system, the personification by the British of native populations as wild and unorganised served as the basis for colonisation. The phrase "beyond the pale" today means to be unacceptable outside of agreed standards of decency. Traits of Irish modes of inhabitation, such as outdoor feasts, subsistence farming techniques, and nomadic movements, were reasons why the British denied their right to sovereignty. Thus, the civil is presented as the cultivator and the savage as the nomad. A common practice within Irish culture reinforcing this personification was bullying, named after the boolie hut, a simple stone shelter constructed as a temporary dwelling in rural areas. Bullying was a form of transhumance farming by which families would relocate with their cattle to common upland pastures in the summer months to rest the land in the lowland areas where their more permanent dwellings were based in the winter. In a view of the present state of Ireland, English poet Edmund Spenser describes bullying as pasturing upon the mountains and waste wild places and removing still to fresh land as they have depastured the former, deeming it uneconomical and wasteful. The series of acts that followed included the enclosing of towns and villages, which stated that it shall be lawful to every tenant and inhabitant to stop, ditch and enclose the land in the strongest manner that they can, indirectly barring this practice of bullying, as it prevented access to the formerly described common land and thus interrupted the cyclical movement. The civil evolves to become the landowner, and the savage is stigmatized as the trespasser. Simultaneously, another form of dwelling rapidly emerging was the tower house, fortified residences of stone, usually 4 or more stories in height, that were erected by both Anglo-Norman and Gaelic families in Ireland from 1400 to 1650, particularly in areas of good agricultural land, such as Munster and South Leinster. A development of the 2-storey hall houses providing rural landmarks in the medieval period, the tower house, in comparison to bullies, demonstrates how English ideas of civilization were represented through proportion and security, and emerged hand in hand with a plot, a device providing a bounded area under private ownership and cultivated to maximize production. Through surrender and regrant, a term coined in the 20th century by William Butler, ownership of land evolved from the collective occupation and inheritance of a Gaelic clan to a single chief holding the land of the crown through a feudal charter. In Spenser's words, to bring them by their own accord into his obedience and to plant a peaceful government amongst them. In 1987, Nicholas Canny criticised what is meant by the acceptance of the lords, that they, by implication, the people whom they ruled, were subjects of the crown, in an extension of ownership from the land to the body. And so the civil is the lord, and the savage is the tenant. However, by the 19th century, all forms of bullying had declined due to the parcellation of lowland areas. Here, owning land had become a greater priority than preserving the ground itself, a concept that becomes even more paramount with the demand for maximum extraction through the plantation.
Barbados, sometimes referred to as Little England, was seen as being vacant and destined for English settlers. The British considered the indigenous people as incapable of improvement, which categorised them as inferior and their lands a waste. As described in Richard Legion's A True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados, during the 17th century, the cultivation of sugar and other commodities was their next immediate help to support them in their great want of sustenance. However, from the former slave Adwa Ekwana, it is not enough that we are torn from the country and friends. To toil for your luxury and lust of gain, must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice. The civil is racializing, the savage is racialized. The development of the plantation marked the change from a wild, untamed land into a meticulously cultivated terrain of sugarcane fields, driven by the increasing European demand for sugar. In the 17th century, sugar monoculture fueled an intensive extraction of the landscape, whereby The number of windmills on a plantation marked its scale and stature, accompanied by Negro yards, which was a common term for enslaved settlements in Barbados. Between the 1660s and 1834, around 400 medium to large plantations, including St. Nicholas Abbey, housed between 101 to 200 enslaved workers each. The imposed landscape evolved organised spatial arrangements of English settlements, where rows of cottages with stone or brick walls and thatched roofs were designed to tie the labourers to the farm. The civil is the plantation manager, the savage is the slave. The Slavery Abolishment Act of 1833 was a British law providing gradual emancipation of enslaved individuals, previously defined as property, resulting in the British government giving out £20 million compensation package to slave owners for their loss. The civil is the owner, the slave is property. The Tenantry Freehold Purchase Act of 1980 in Barbados did not allow the emancipated slaves to own land, but instead construct a temporary dwelling upon the land in which they worked. Historically linked to the located labourer system, these tenantries coerced formerly enslaved people into a system of debt peonage where rent for houses and land deducted from their wages, leading to the risk of eviction. In the case of St. Nicholas Abbey, the tenant yard emerges beside the former Negro yard. In comparison to the slave cabin, the chattel house was made of imported timber and, due to the tenants not owning the land, had to be small and easily dismantled and movable structures. Despite there being widespread security in land tenure, people in Barbados continue to purchase wooden chattel houses, typically using concrete blocks to make them more permanent dwellings. Once the conversion to a concrete house is complete, the wooden chattel house is removed from the interior and sold or gifted to the family. Despite the workers of the land legally having property rights, the landholding system ultimately helped to keep the plantation intact. Even with a change of terminology, the tenantry operated as a legalized version of the so-called Negro yard. The civil is the landlord, the savage is the tenant.
Unlike in the previous two examples, when Britain acquired Cyprus in 1878 from the Ottoman Empire, it demonstrated the primacy of strategic over economic motives. Cyprus is strategically located in the Eastern Mediterranean, making it a valuable geopolitical asset. It was to be used as a place of arms and a key to Asia, and one of the outposts securing the route to India. A formal excuse for the colonial rule over Cyprus was the presented inability of the state to govern and administrate itself. William Baird wrote, "The rascality of the natives was as idyllic as innocence. Not necessarily savages, the Cypriots were never presented as equal to the colonial powers, thus they had to be administered, governed, and protected. The civil is the administrator, the savage is the administrated." In order to solidify its rule over the island, the British colonial government enforced the Cyprus Land Regulations of 1881 and the Cyprus Land Acquisition of 1907, making it easier for the British to seize, control, and tax the land, for example, declaring all forests estate property, and only a person registered in the books of the Land Registry Office could qualify as an owner or occupier. British military camps are a manifestation of the administrating power of the colonial rule. They sit in contrast to the scenes of traditional rituals and practice taking place in the region, such as Troodos Mountain. The army did not move to Troodos for any strategic reason, nor to avail the natural resources that might have occurred on the mountain, but for the health of the British subjects stationed in Cyprus, civilian and military. In the early years, the use of Troodos appears to have been non-structured and transient. Individual units were at liberty to select their campsites for the year. The War Department's presence on Troodos was cemented into history when in 1887 they were granted permission to occupy 600 acres on the mountain for military purposes from the colonial government. This solidification was marked with design changes. Temporary tent became officers' hut, constructed out of wood and corrugated iron, characteristic of British expeditionary campaigns. The definition of military purposes seems to historically have come from the health of the troops serving in the Middle and Far East regions. There is a common belief that the colonisation process was distinctly different in Cyprus in comparison to other British colonies, due to the fact that it was acquired for geopolitical rather than economic reasons. However, Kitchener's topographical survey of 1878 illustrates the opposite. Pre-British period and before the colonial map, census and survey team, territorial units were often more fluid, more defined by communal relationships, kinship groups, and ongoing political negotiation than by arbitrary and imaginary lines on the ground. With Kitchener's total survey as a basis, the various government departments could continue with the imperial project of demarcation. Demarcation of space goes hand in hand with demarcation between people, and a map showing Greek-speaking Cypriot and Turkish-speaking Cypriot villages can exasperate or even manufacture the division, rather than merely recording it. The civil is the categorizing, the savage is the subject.
The project of colonisation by the British Empire in its efforts to recreate English common law to its far-reaching global territory reveals how property law became abstracted from a geographical place and time. The imposition of the English feudal system failed to respond to its conditions in each place and subsequently caused a disconnection between the landowner and the land itself. Enclosing its bounds, extracting its resources, and utilising its geographical position as an asset, each case demonstrates how property law ultimately contradicts environmental justice that is fundamentally based on local knowledge of the land, a sharing of resources, and sustainable agricultural practices.
For maybe a few of the last presentations is obviously a lot of this work is by nature cross-disciplinary, right? And I wondered if you had a thought, maybe you guys, but also some of the ones who presented before, about where you target architectural agency and who we need to talk to enact change or to shift some of the issues that you've raised.
I think particularly in this case, and maybe the one before, it seems to be coming up of like the state and the government kind of top-down initiative. I mean, part of the problem that we were trying to outline in this is it's the top-down view that causes this kind of land demarcation and division of space that contradicts the more button-up, actually more local like means of living that arguably are more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. And so in a sense, it's kind of, I guess, joining together that top-down and bottom-up view to a point where like decisions that are being made from a governmental level or strategic or legal perspective actually respond to the condition on the ground itself.
Seeding Territories, the Botanical Frontier, a critical analysis of cotton, corn, and tulips in colonial expansion. In 2001, pioneer and American agribusiness patented the hybrid corn seed. Genetic engineering of seeds pushes the boundaries of bioprospecting, where genetic codes themselves become patentable property. Global agrochemical corporations like Bayer and Monsanto capitalize on this intellectual enclosure, generating income from lawsuits and monopolizing access to seeds. With this as our starting point, we ask, what histories, forces, and systems of power enable this to happen? And what were the territorial implications of plant commodification? Through the development of global capitalism, scales of commodification grew increasingly fine-grained. Colonial processes of land appropriation created legal fictions of property, and in doing so, commodified anything contained within the boundaries of property, from the bodies of laborers to the seeds themselves. Now, under neoliberalism, legal frameworks of property infiltrate to the scale of the genome. Our project is interested in the spatial consequences of botanical colonialism, the commodification, extraction, representation, and instrumentalization of plant life to power colonization. Through 3 case studies, we examine what we term the botanical frontier to understand how the commodification of cotton, corn, and tulips was instrumental in shaping European imperial expansion, in developing systems of enclosure, and structuring settlement patterns. The colonial botanical frontier is an expanding border of imperial control over plants, land, and ecological knowledge. If a frontier is defined through the creation of binary conditions of known and unknown, near and distant, and master and subject, the botanical frontier applies these binaries to the specificities of botanical colonialism. The botanical frontier is the colonial project of economic botany, the financialization of plant life for profit. It operates through different means of control and at different scales, both creating and being created by colonial and capitalist matrices of power emerging during this period. Ultimately, it is the driving force by which land is seized, divided, and transformed into property used for plantation agriculture.
As the frontier consumes external land, it creates territories of enclosure that are regulated by the grid, the primary frontier infrastructure. The grid structures property lines, the layout of plantation agriculture, and settlement patterns. The frontier perceives land outside these enclosures as empty, wild, and savage. Laws such as the doctrine of discovery deemed colonial violence legitimate, fueling notions of unlimited land free to claim. This is clearly legible in the cotton frontier of the so-called United States.
As land was seized and parceled for plantation, enslaved laborers cleared swamps and forests, plowing soil to create a perceived tabula rasa. Then cotton seeds were sown in regular rows, cultivated until their profitable bolls were ripe for harvest. After 10 to 15 years, plantation soil will be exhausted and abandoned, allowing the same cycle to repeat with the next purchased parcel. While cotton plantation expanded in the south, settlers in the northeast were planting another profitable crop, corn. In Virginia, the surveying of individual properties followed the meets and bounds system. Using chains and compasses, lines were marked from a designated starting point, often a natural features like an oak tree.
Through surveying techniques, the land was divided and transformed into private property.
Similarly, in the Dutch tulip frontier, the property grid manifests in the polder system. The Dutch territory constantly negotiated between liquid and solid, with large dikes and canals demarcating a hard line between land and sea. Infrastructural elements such as drainage stations and windmills act as mediators between this parcel land, serving as the interface between the states, local government, and their territories. Initially serving to combat floods and support traditional agriculture, polders evolved into mass production and logistics spaces by the 20th century, greeted to maximize profit. One of the first polders to epitomize this economic shift was the Hortus Medicus in Leiden. With gridded beds mirroring financial records, it established a direct relationship between plants and accounting books.
As the Dutch Empire grew, so did its exotic floral trade, transforming these polders into hubs of economic exchange. As the polder's value shifted from agricultural capacity to exchange value, they became tools of botanical colonialism. The painting, Satire on Tulip Mania by Jan Bruegel, humorously critiques the 17th century tulip mania. During this time, tulips, which were introduced from Turkey, became wildly popular due to their exotic patterns caused by a virus-induced process.
The painting portrays monkeys in upper-class attire negotiating and counting money. The money urinating on tulips symbolized the folly of overvaluing these flowers.
The satire captures tulip mania's absurd excesses, where bulb prices surpass domestic properties in value, fueling social status, political ambitions, and trade, and shaping the era's economic and cultural landscape. The tulip's allure in Europe paralleled a growing obsession with cotton, which became the first mass-produced luxury commodity. Degas' 1873 painting of cotton merchants in New Orleans reveals the erasure of black labor in the creation of a white commodity.
This portrait of the cotton industry shows the life cycle of cotton, from its raw form on the merchant's table to its importance as a tradable asset, recorded by bookkeeping, to its transportation via steamship to British textile factories, and finally emerging through finished fabrics demand wear.
Absent from the image is the cotton industry's reliance on slave labor.
Corn, though not a luxury good, was key to the success of settlements as a staple food.
Sidney King's 20th century painting enforces ideas of Western superiority by contrasting the colonists' military strength, technological advancements, and settlement patterns with that of the indigenous Powhatans. It constructs a binary between the settlers' tools that were traded for corn, the settlers' ships and the indigenous settlements, and the settlers' firearms and the Powhatans' bow and arrow. These contrasting images further a narrative of colonial dominance that legitimized genocide, land theft, and the biopiracy of corn. Power, desire, and capital accumulation all propelled the botanical frontier. The ultimate colonial botanical enclosure is the plantation. The plantation is land turned factory, where plants become machines, the logical conclusion of the colonial imaginary bent on the maximization of profit through exploitation of land and labor. Here, the fields and the factory synthesize into a reciprocal unit of production. The field factory shape binaries of center-periphery and rural-urban. In the case of cotton, field conditions were peripheral sites of production and extraction, powered by enslaved labor. The raw cotton was then channeled to the factories in the center, which is the growing industrializing city of Manchester. Though separated by an ocean, the field factory linked global territories through the control, transport, and trade of plant assets. Cotton drove the industrialization of Britain. The first modern factory was actually a cotton mill. As cotton profitability soared, it sustained settlement in the American South and drove mass land grabs such as Louisiana Purchase. We can trace the history of the United States as a process of enclosure, beginning with that of the slave ship. From this perspective, the logical conclusion of the American plantation is the prison. In the case of the Angola cotton plantation, the current reconfiguration as a maximum security state penitentiary reveals slavery as ongoing in the United States. The story of cotton cannot be separated from labor politics, as plantation crops require vast numbers of workers to handpick cotton bolls. With the supposed abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865, the 13th Amendment reconstructed slavery through prison labor. The modern prison industrial complex is linked to the botanical frontier, where the commodification of plants as crops motivates the cheapest labor possible to maximize profits. Reading the Angola plantation prison in layers, we see how this peninsular landscape along the Mississippi River was initially divided into 7 antebellum cotton plantations. Layers of property emerged through land grants, parcels, and state boundaries. The prison's development is closely linked to the plantation, where the slaves' quarters first acted as a site of incarceration in 1880.
The state of Louisiana took control of the site in 1901, building a large-scale penitentiary that now encompasses the entire territory. By 2008, it was the size of Manhattan, composed almost entirely of black prisoners and overseen by white officers called freemen. The prison currently operates as a profitable enterprise including crops, a mattress factory, a rodeo, and a cattle ranch.
Cheaper forced labor has always gone hand in hand with the plantation.
In the case of Jamestown, the Virginia Company funded indentured servants to settle. These indentured servants were sold to the landowners by the company to work at profit-driven corn plantations. Their dwellings were separated from the landowners by additional rings of fencing to enforce hierarchies. The plantation method in Plymouth shows settlers' appropriation of indigenous ecological knowledge, such as the Three Sisters intercropping. In contrast, the plantation in Jamestown took the spacing between corn that they have observed from indigenous crops but placed them as monocultural grid to create higher yield, but leading to soil exhaustion.
Corn, cotton, and tulips transformed into financial assets that operated as para-currencies, reduced to tradable units. Through the field factory, both plants and workers became instruments for surplus value creation. Storage for surplus crops then became an essential frontier technology.
Native Americans invented corn cribs, an open-air elevated structure for corn ear storage. Settlers frequently raided the cribs for seeds and appropriated the building form for their own cribs using European buildings method and materials. This typology is still used today as a round conical structure that facilitates the use of elevators. In the case of tulip, hothouses dominated in the Netherlands, exemplified by the Magdalena Paul's Gunterstein Castle. Here, flowers were received from colonial outposts, were manipulated in controlled environment to align with local weather conditions in Holland.
The garden emphasized the colonization of diverse climates, revealing a shift from spatial management to the orchestration of a logistical system independent of geographical location.
The Wardian case revolutionized plant transport, functioning as a compact hothouse. It enables the shipment of potted flowers as individual commodities from colonies to the Netherlands, with customized versions tailored to each plant's requirement.
Puel's potted plants led to the widespread domestication of plants within households. Plant territories became ambiguous, no longer confined to a fixed geography. This shift not only transformed landscapes, but also revolutionized how plants were cultivated, nurtured, and exchanged.
We understand the botanical frontier as a spatial project that created multi-scalar enclosures and shaped settlement patterns. The role of seeds and plants in colonial processes is often overlooked in decolonial discourse. We want to recenter the narratives in the formation of the highly unequal globalized world we live in today. Because as scholar Catriona Sandilands explains, colonialism is a multi-species process. Our starting point is historical, but we understand colonialism as an ongoing process of dispossession, exploitation, genocide, and ecocide. We believe that in tracing the development of these three plants within colonialist and capitalist matrices of power, and in understanding how and why they were made into imperial commodities, we may gain a better understanding of the root causes of our planetary crisis. In finding connections between power, land, labor, and the creation of nature, we may begin to see a path toward a future beyond commodification, plantations, and even property itself.